You know what we really like to do here at the Marist Poll? Poll! Duh! This time on Poll Hub, 3 more sets of results from our summer of swing state polls with NBC News. And these 3, they're the real deal. States that could go either way. Missouri and Indiana are where Democrats are trying to hold the line. Tennessee is a GOP stronghold that's looking maybe a little bit less so in 2018. What does this all mean for November? What does it mean for President Trump? We've polled 12 critical states over the summer, and there's some pretty interesting trends that have emerged. Got a lot to talk about. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Up. I'm Jenny Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
Hi, and I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Meringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion. And we just changed order for the first time in, what is this? We're pushing 60 podcasts, right?
Who's pushing 60? Actually, yeah. Yeah, we'll be here all week, and please tip your waitress. 59. This is episode 59, and we're back in Potown, back in Poughkeepsie after a slight detour to the beach.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we have it's cooler by the shore.
Yeah,
and we have a special guest producer today. You've been hearing a lot about Kenny Marples. Now, behind the producer's desk. This won't last, though. Mary's coming back. I can feel it.
So what do we got on tap?
Yeah, so we have been polling all summer long. This has been a very busy summer, and for good reason. 2018, as we've talked about repeatedly, is shaping up to be really perhaps the most dramatic midterm election in our lifetimes. NBC News, our polling partner, has been wanted us to look at a lot of states. We've looked at 12 different states. The latest batch are really, to me, among the most interesting. Wisconsin and Michigan were really interesting for a whole bunch of reasons because they decided the election in some ways. But Indiana,
in 2016, they were really different, and there was a lot of interest to see if that was going to hold,
right?
And whether it will hold.
This time, it's Indiana, Missouri, and Tennessee. Now, at face value, you might go, well, wait, Indiana, always Republican. Tennessee, it's in South Republican. Missouri, that kind of swings back and forth. But why are these so interesting? There's a Democratic senator in Missouri and a Democratic senator in Indiana. Mm-hmm. The Democrats' chances of retaking the Senate are entirely dependent on these two holding their seats.
Absolutely.
So what's going on in Missouri?
Well, I think what we're seeing in Missouri, which is really sending out generally a mixed message right now. We're seeing President Trump with a 44% approval rating. That's better than he has elsewhere. But that's still nothing to write home about if you're going to be riding in on the coattails.
It's a short coattail.
That's not much indeed. And voters are telling us they want more Democrats elected to Congress, but that's still only a plurality say that to offset the President Trump. But they still want the Republicans to be the party in control. Democrats, like elsewhere, saying they're more enthusiastic about the election. But that enthusiasm doesn't carry over to the generic ballot question where we've been hearing around the country that Democrats are more enthusiastic. Well, not so in Missouri. So that gets us to the Senate race when you kind of look at this mixed picture. And Claire McCaskill, of course, the Democratic incumbent, looking for a third term. She was first elected in 2006, reelected in 2012.
And remember, 2006 was really the last Democratic wave election.
That's right. And she beat an incumbent that year. And then in 2012, that was the Todd Akin horrible line about legitimate rape victims and all that stuff. And ended up winning that race by 16 points in Missouri.
Right, which is pretty unheard of that a Democrat wins a statewide race
and then,
Missouri. You got to have a pretty flawed candidate.
Yes.
To win by 16.
Indeed. And then you turn around and Donald Trump carries the state in the presidential election by 18 points. So now McCaskill's facing a odd situation because it's a tough race in a tough state.
And she's running against who?
She's running against the Attorney General, but he was just elected last year.
And he's Republican, relatively popular.
Yep, but not all that well known either. He's the Attorney General, but he's only served for a year. His name's Josh Hawley, and the race is pretty much dead even. In a sense, hasn't totally been defined because her favorability is kind of upside down. He's still not well known. So there's
a couple of independent candidates.
Yeah, and when you put them into the equation, she has a narrow advantage. But this is clearly a state that's still going to be heard from in the 2 months we have roughly until election.
Isn't it generally a bad sign for a two-term incumbent senator to be upside down in a popularity rating? Isn't that you wouldn't be wanting to be running that campaign, I'm guessing?
Well, you have to sort of now run ahead of that. You have to beat your favorability, which for her among likely voters is only 41%. But he's at 36. And his negatives are almost, there's 36 also. Hers are 49. The difference, I think, is that 28% of voters, likely voters, are telling us they just don't know about him.
Well, it's got to be tough for an incumbent whose unfavorable rating is pushing the 50-yard line.
Yeah. So right now, you might think that she's getting close when you start thinking of her at around 47. That may be somewhat of a ceiling for her. But then again, it's a multi-candidate field. And we saw what that did in some states to benefit Donald Trump in the presidential. Sometimes multi-candidates, the third and other minor party candidates weaken as voters vote strategically, but sometimes people vote ideologically, and then they go for one of the minor party candidates to make a statement.
So it seems like
that may hold the balance in the state.
It also seems like there's the classic case here of if you can define your opponent who is not well known before your opponent defines himself or herself, you can win in a case like Claire McCaskill, where you're not particularly popular. That's kind of an old standard line in politics. How successful can she be in defining him? He is the Attorney General, though. He's a statewide elected official.
But recent. He's run statewide.
So who spends the more money on TV? The old style stuff probably makes a difference.
Yeah, and there have been already some noise in the state about different issues that have gone back and forth. And look, this is going to be a high-profile, rough-and-tumble contest before this one gets determined. It's probably a state we're going to go back and take another look at because it is just that close and, as you indicated, just that important.
And it's very polarizing too. Yeah. You really see people dividing up in terms of demography, in terms of party and politics. I mean, like some of the things that we've seen in a number of the other states, we're seeing a pretty significant gender gap.
30 points. I mean, it's huge.
Yeah, and so I think that there are going to be a lot of factors at play.
Yeah. One other thing I would point out, and then we can move on to the other states. Right now, Hawley's carrying independents, but she's getting more Republicans than he's getting Democrats. So there's a little bit, and that's something we're going to be watching for very closely with Donald Trump being kind of the shadow of all these
disaffected
races.
Republicans.
Yeah. Maybe that, or just maybe some women. There's a lot of women candidates around the country, and they're picking up votes, and that may be part of the gender gap that we're seeing also. So that's a factor we're going to look at, and I think Barb.
So we go from the show me state to the Hoosier state, Indiana.
Well, also Lee mentioned independence.
Independence.
And
Missouri.
independents in Indiana are pretty significant. In fact, what we have seen is in the latest polling is that independents really have soured on Trump and the GOP. Now, you mentioned earlier, Jay, that Indiana tends to be thought of as a Republican state. I mean, Obama did carry it in 2008. Democratic, senators are not unknown to Indiana.
As long as their last name is By.
Well, that counts. And so they do have a Senate race with an incumbent Democrat. Trying to hold his seat this time around. But I think what's really interesting here is that the independents, 54% of independents has told us that they believe that their vote will send a message that more Democrats are needed to serve as a check and balance on President Trump this November. And again, for a state that overwhelmingly supported
Trump in 2016,
That's a pretty significant number. A couple of other things,
And a
too.
region in the country that was the part of the region of the country that made the difference.
Upper Midwest, yeah.
Yeah, and a plurality of Indiana independent voters also prefer the Democrat control of Congress rather than having Republican control of Congress, and which means when we actually look at the congressional generic question, 45% of independents support a Democratic candidate compared with 35% who support the Republican. So that's actually a 10-point spread, which really got our attention this time around. So what does that mean for the Senate race? We have incumbent Democrat Donnelly, who
Joe Donnelly. Now, there's a guy in 2016, in
2012.
2012, ran against, you thought we talked about a flawed candidate in Missouri. The candidate in Indiana was even more flawed, and that's widely seen how he
That
won.
was a really expensive race in 2012. I think it was third or fourth in the country to get that seat, because what happened was Senator Lugar, who'd been a long-time senator in Indiana, lost the nomination.
The primary, yeah.
The primary,
the Republican primary.
the Republican nomination to run for Senate. And in Indiana, you're not allowed to be on the ballot in November if you do not get the nomination of the party earlier on in the primary season.
And it was a Tea Party favorite that won. This is part of the whole Tea Party way, right?
Absolutely. And, and he wasn't, unknown to Indianans either. He was a conservative, and he just ran into a little bit of a problem. He was supported by a number of outside groups. In fact, both Donnelly and Richard Murdoch, who had been the state treasurer, were both supported by a lot of outside groups in 2012. And they both tried to paint each other, their opponents, as real extremists. And I think what kind of fed into the Donnelly, the Democrat narrative, was when Murdoch was speaking about, again, rape, and said that, life is that gift from God, that even when it begins in a horrible situation of rape, it's something that God has intended to happen. And that was something, as a pro-life Republican, he was trying to balance both sides. But certainly, you can understand how that was then taken, in the heat of the campaign.
So that's how Donnelly won last time, or at least that helped.
And those were two seats, Missouri and Indiana. Right. The Republicans really kicked away.
Claire McCaskill's kind of battling for her seat here, neck and neck. How's Joe Donnelly doing keeping his seat?
Well, he is again. He is in a close contest here against his opponent, Mike Braun. Mike Braun, again, being a businessman, he had to give up his, I believe, state Senate seat in Indiana in order to run. So he retired from that, and he's in a very competitive race. When we look at this, we also have a libertarian in the primary. In the contest as well. And when we look at a three-way race, Donnelly, the Democrat, Braun, the Republican, and the Libertarian candidate, Donnelly currently has just a 3-point edge, and we don't even call that necessarily an edge in polling. So that's a very tight race. Interestingly and oddly, what we saw was that once we took the Libertarian candidate out, Donnelly actually has a stronger lead, just one-on-one with Braun, 49-43.
So he's doing better than McCaskill, really. Not that you can compare one state to another directly, but here are two states where there's very similar situations, and Joe Donnelly's looking better than Claire McCaskill.
Probably a little less vulnerable.
Yeah.
Well, because I think also he is favorably viewed by.
Okay, there's a difference.
Yeah, he's not upside down like
He's
Claire
not
McCaskill.
upside down like Claire McCaskill is, and so. But we'll see. Braun brings a lot of money to the table. I believe Trump sat out the primary. I think there were 3 Republicans, and I don't think he endorsed any of them, but they all tried to be as close to Trump as possible. But Mike Braun, comes to the table with a lot of his own money.
Yeah. The funny thing is that the vice president president is from Indiana, Mike Pence, and that doesn't seem to be helping
His
very
approval
much.
rating was not great.
Right, was not
when
great.
he became vice.
Yeah.
So then we pulled a state that we didn't expect, let's say 6 months ago or a year ago, that we'd be polling. That was Tennessee.
Right.
And now that's on the radar.
So Bob Corker is the Republican senator who's retiring, and he's retiring much like in Arizona, where we have Jeff Flake retiring fairly early in their careers, and at least part of the perception is they're doing so because they've been critical of Donald Trump and they're Republicans, and being critical of Donald Trump and being a Republican means you're going to have trouble in a primary because, as we've seen over and over and over, the Republican Party is the Trump Party right now, at least in terms of primaries. So Tennessee, we are looking at a really interesting race. But before I even mention the race, I am stunned by the favorable unfavorables on Donald Trump there, because we have seen in other states like Texas, for instance, and in Indiana, Missouri, which we just talked about, these are not like New York and California numbers. Now,
No, these are not blue states.
They're not blue states. But in Tennessee, when you look at the approval rating of how the president is doing, and we've been looking more and more at strongly approve and strongly disapprove to really get at that
intensity.
passion and intensity. And so this is just likely voters in Tennessee that I'm talking about. But 32% strongly approve of the job that he's doing. That's a pretty high number. And 38% strongly disapprove. In Tennessee, the president, among likely voters, and the strongest, most passionate case is upside down. I'm stunned by that.
But a lot closer than elsewhere. So it's a little bit both ways.
It's a lot closer, but it's not what you'd expect in the South.
No,
Tennessee, I understand, butts up against Ohio and Indiana, all these states we're talking about. So it's not the South in the traditional way, but it's also not a state, since Al Gore has been gone, that has been particularly Democratic.
And just to add, I mean, the president is right side up.
Right.
Overall.
I was backing into that. So just among likely voters, his approval rating is 47 to 43. But the intensity is similar to what we've seen elsewhere, in that it's kind of on the Democratic side. You'd mentioned independents in Indiana. Independents in Tennessee, which is interesting, 43-43. So Indiana, it rolls right off the tongue. But Tennessee independents are split 43-43 on their favorability of the president. So what does that mean for the Senate race? A former governor, the last Democratic statewide elected official, Phil Bredesen, is running. He was a pretty popular former Democratic governor, and he's running against Marsha Blackburn, who is a congresswoman there who's pretty well known because nationally she's been a Fox News favorite, a real firebrand, kind of Sarah Palin-esque figure. And that's very popular with the Tea Party, very, very popular with the Trumpians, but not necessarily very popular when you're running statewide. Among likely voters, Phil Bredesen is up by 2. This is not a huge margin, but he's up by 2, 48-46. But when you look at down the list, some of the same things we've seen gender gaps, we've seen age gaps, things like that. Here's one that's flipped, and this may say more about Tennessee than about anything else. People whose household income is less than $50,000. Now that's been Trump, folks, right? I mean, that's been all about Trump. Phil Bredesen, 57%. Marsha Blackburn, 37%.
Wow.
It's flipped. 50,000 or more, Blackburn's up 54-42. Isn't that crazy? It's completely flipped from every other state we've seen, where the wealthier people are, and generally that adds to education and all that.
It's a page out of elections of a long time ago era, when it just was the other way around.
When it was the other way around.
You would think that perhaps we had an error in the numbers.
No, never.
But there's also a governor's race.
That's right.
In Tennessee.
That's good to point out.
There's also a governor's race. Real quick, the reason Bredesen probably has that 2-point lead is his favorable rating is 61% among likely voters. That's a good favorability rating for a guy who's been out of office for a while. But sometimes, our memories grow hazy, and we like people more when they're out of office than when they were in. George Bush is much more popular now than he was in 2008.
So is Jimmy Carter.
And so is Jimmy Carter. So there's also a governor's race there. And in the governor's race,
it's playing more true to form.
It's playing very true to form. In this case, the Democrat Carl Dean is at 40% among likely voters, and Bill Lee, the Republican's at 53%. So 13-point margin there. And that's, like you said, more true to form. But here we have 2 states where Democrats are trying to hold on to a seat, could be tough, and a state where Republicans shouldn't even have to think about it, right? I mean, come on. Tennessee, no big deal. And What do you got? You got a horse race.
For the Democrats, a gift that we're even talking about, Tennessee. There's several other things that I thought that were kind of interesting about these three states that I wanted to bring out. First of all, the Koch brothers, well-known supporters of Republican and conservative causes, have
not Donald Trump.
Not everyone, recently have said $5 million they're going to spend on 3 Senate races. They'll probably spend more on others, but the 3 they picked were Wisconsin, to try to unseat Tammy Baldwin. We've talked about her in an earlier program. And then Missouri and Tennessee. Yeah. Those were the 3 they mentioned, which I think I just heard lengthy discussions about on our part. So let me talk a little bit about these 3 states. So first of all, there was one other thing I thought that was really, really interesting. Traditionally, we know that likely voters tend to be more Republican than the broader electorate of registered voters. So when we do polling, we go from registered to likely voters, which we do now after Labor Day, to get a sense of what the people who are the most probable voters are.
They're the ones who are likely to show up.
And what's interesting in these 3 states, not an appreciable difference between registered and likely voters. So what are we seeing? You hear about the enthusiasm advantage of Democrats. Well, that seems to be nullifying this traditional movement that the Republicans benefit when you look at likely voters. Right now, it doesn't matter.
So the likely voter gap is closed by the enthusiasm gap in the part of the Democrats.
In essence.
And so what you're saying is when people are talking about this Democratic wave, it's not necessarily that Democrats are going to be outnumbering Republicans, but just maybe matching their turnout.
Or offsetting a traditional disadvantage they have when you get closer to election day. And a few other things about these 3 states that I think really jumped out. When you look at the 12 states that we have polled this summer, these states are the 3 highest for Donald Trump's approval rating. So we've gone through a whole bunch of states, and Indiana, Missouri, and Tennessee are the 3 best for him.
Better than Texas.
Yes, Texas was 2 points lower, 3 points lower.
That's crazy.
Wow.
It's the highest of 6 states, including Texas, in terms of his favorability. And when we asked about, do you want a Congress controlled by Republicans, 3 of the 4 states, those are the ones we're talking about, the 4th one being Texas. So those are the ones in the generic question, on the congressional ballot question, 3 or 4 states, again, that want Republicans to be, they're going to vote for Republicans more than Democrats for Congress. It's these 3 states we're talking about today, and Texas.
So it's remarkable that in all 3 of these states, the Democrat is nominally, and in some cases by a fair amount, ahead among likely voters.
So what you have is
they're
people,
certainly holding their own.
Or they're holding, but they're ahead or tied.
So they're going against a grain. These are states that are, red states that aren't really blue states, even if the Democrats happen to win. But there's now other candidate forces at work here which are making a difference. So I think that's, there's Donald Trump and there's other stuff.
And I think also something that's very interesting is the difference in the congressional generic question. Because at the last couple of weeks, I think what we've been seeing is a widening of the congressional generic in favor of the Democrats nationally.
Yes. Nationally.
And a decrease in Donald Trump's standing to some degree.
Yes, and when we look at these states individually, and I know we say this over and over that the national numbers don't necessarily reflect what's going on in individual contests or in individual states, but I think this really speaks to that issue of the difference of when we're looking at midterm elections and we're looking state by state to look at counts and Senate seats, how important the state races are and how different that can be from the overall national numbers.
And we're going to be looking at lots more states and seeing lots more stuff. This is going to be I love elections, I love polling, and this is our season again.
That's what we do.
Comes around so quickly.
And that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College here in Poughkeepsie, New York. Hey, the students are back. Mary Griffith is our executive producer, and sitting in the chair today, Kenny Marples. Thanks for the help. He's also going to be editing this.
And we'll be able to tell later just how good a job he really did. Actually, he can cover for his own editing with his own producing, or vice versa.
Whichever, yeah. It should be good. There's no excuses.
No excuses at all. But also, we would like to also, while we're thanking people and organizations, to thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell University. They give us the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades when we are doing that kind of analysis.
And send your comments to pollhub@marist.edu or reach out to us on social media. We love questions, feedback, comments, as long as, we can, they're G-rated. But look for us on Twitter, Facebook,
Speak
every
for
place.
yourself about that one. I don't know
We
if
can
Jay
do
and I would-
PG.
Yeah, we can go
PG-13.
Okay,
I think we can do
PG. Yeah, well, I hate anything that's too intense. Life gets
This
too
is why
crazy.
she's not on Twitter, Lee.
And please,
You don't know what you're missing.
wherever you listen to us, please just hit that subscribe button.